Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the University of Delaware's National Agenda program. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. Thank you all for being here. We know it's a debate night tonight. We're going to try to wrap up a little bit early tonight, and I want to let you know that if you're interested in watching the debate right after tonight's program, you'll be able to do so a few steps away, right across the sidewalk out here in Gore Hall, room 116, or in Smith Hall, room 120. We'll be showing the debates live if you want to watch that. We tend to think of presidential election years as being exclusively about the presidency. After all, that is the big prize, with all it implies about the president's role as a commander-in-chief and as leader of the executive branch of government. But a basic fact of American government is that in every presidential year, and this year is no exception, of course, 1/3 of the U.S. Senate is up for election, and all 435 members of the House of Representatives are up for election as well. Control of the executive branch, Congress, is definitely in the balance. Most handicappers in both major parties do not expect the House to change hands this year. The Republican Party is widely expected to retain majority control of the House. But the Senate, which is now in majority Democratic control, could be a different story. The New York Times currently estimates that of the 100 Senate seats, 82 either are not up for election this year or solidly in the hands of one party or the other. The remaining 18 seats are the ones over which a very heated political battle is being fought right now, involving many millions of dollars. The Wall Street Journal calculates that super PACs have already spent more than $50 million on Senate races. Most of that, $36 million, is being spent on negative advertising designed to defeat candidates for the Senate, while merely, and I say merely in quotes, $15 million, I'll take it, is being used to support candidates. Our guest speaker tonight, Kenneth Spain, has been literally in the middle of the battle for Congress in the recent past. He's been on the ground in battleground states working to elect members of Congress, the House and the Senate. He's been at the Washington level trying to engineer national congressional election strategy. Ken Spain was former communication director and national spokesman for the National Republican Congressional Committee in Washington, the communication director for Bush-Cheney 2004 in New Mexico, and a former campaign strategist for several Republican members of Congress from Arizona and Texas. In the last election, 2010, Ken is credited with having helped engineer the Republican Party's powerful resurgence in Congress after the 2008 defeat of George W. Bush. Ken was part of the GOP leadership crew which gave what President Obama admitted was a drubbing in 2010. Before that, Ken worked on Capitol Hill for Representative K. Michael Conway, who's a Republican from Texas, and communications director for Representative John Shadegg, a Republican from Arizona. He previously worked in Arizona, New Mexico, and California for Republican candidates for national and state offices. Ken Spain earned his bachelor's degree in history from the University of California at Santa Barbara. He's originally from Whittier, California. Please welcome Ken Spain to the University of Delaware.
Good evening. Well, as Ralph said, my name is Ken Spain. How many people here, I'd just be curious, actually know what the National Republican Congressional Committee, or the NRCC, does? Well, the NRCC, for those of you who don't, is in charge essentially of winning House races for Republicans in Washington, D.C. The NRCC is housed inside the same building as the Republican National Committee. And the job of the NRCC is essentially to do a number of things. It's to recruit candidates, it's to fundraise for the party, it's to do field operations, to run communications, which I did. I had a team of 10 underneath me that was assigned to all various aspects of the country in terms of helping candidates develop their messages, working against Democratic candidates, et cetera. And most importantly, what the NRCC does, probably the biggest role is advertising, whether it's on TV or in the mail, or on radio, et cetera. All those horrible, nasty ads that you hear, typically, if it's in a House race, we're responsible for them in many instances. the National Campaign Committee really plays a critical role in winning elections in this country. And a lot of people really don't understand what it does and who it is. It's relatively anonymous to most people, but in terms of playing the critical role, it really has made, I think in many ways, was probably responsible for anywhere between 15 to 20 seats, I think, this last cycle in terms of what could have been a 40 to 45 seat win on election night in 2010 to what was eventually a 63-seat win, which turned out to be the largest congressional victory in 80 years. As I said, my job was to lead the communications effort there. We worked very closely with now House Speaker John Boehner, Eric Cantor, the House Republican leadership team, also in partnership with the Republican National Committee and with the Senate as well. I think the way I wanted to start really quickly is, first of all, I think we need to look at, in looking at 2012, I think we really have to look at 2010, because in many ways 2010 really has set the table for the political debate that's going to occur, and in many ways the debate that's going to occur tonight in the debate. First of all, Republicans, as I said, had a very big year in 2010, but the effect goes really beyond just the House of Representatives and the seats that were picked up in the Senate. As many of you are aware, redistricting, congressional redistricting occurs at the legislative level. And as part of this wave election in 2010, a number of state legislatures flipped to the Republican side as well. And there were a number of states where there were very large beneficiaries, in a sense, like North Carolina, that had historically a Democratic delegation, will now be very likely a predominantly Republican one after this election. And there are a number of states that have kind of fallen in line with that as well, just because the party that wins gets to draw the lines. However, the story that's often not told is there are a number of Republican races that have typically been very, where you have a Republican member of Congress who's been a perennial target of the Democratic side, who's been in tough races for years, if not decades. And in a lot of those seats, for instance, there's one example would be Jim Gerlach, who's from suburban Philadelphia, sits in what has been a perennial target every year, and his seat this time got 1 to 2 points better, and now is essentially, I think, is in a comfortable position to win re-election. And those 1 to 2 points obviously go a very long way when it comes to winning what are very tight congressional races. Also, in regards to what 2010 did, I think it really enticed a lot of new candidates to run this time around. After 2006 and 2008, it was very hard for Republicans to entice good candidates to run, because you take a look, oftentimes, I think, mistakenly, people take a look at the last election and they try to look at the election in front of them by looking in the rearview mirror. Now, in this instance, it's benefited the Republicans. I think that the recruiting class for Republican candidates this time around, I think, and I'll fully admit that I am biased, but I think it does in this instance surpass that of the Democratic class this time around. But also, I think it's really put some new races into play. I think in the Boston area, for instance, Republicans will have their first openly gay, a very moderate Republican candidate running in a traditionally heavily Democratic seat, and that Republican is very likely to win. So I think that you're going to see a number of places kind of pop up on the map over the course of the next few weeks that I think will be a little bit of a surprise, but I think are really more of a testament to the Republican recruitment effort, but also because a lot of people took a look at 2010 and said, hey, maybe this is my opportunity to run. On the flip side of that, though, however, you have a lot of candidates who maybe aren't the best candidates in the world who decide, you know what, maybe I should take a crack at this. And I think we've seen a number of candidates do so, unfortunately. I think that we're going to see some limited or a cap on our ability to make gains in the United States Senate as a result of that. I think probably Missouri, the Missouri Senate race is case in point with Todd Akin. I think that's going to be a very difficult race for Republicans to win, which should have been, I think, a pretty easy Republican pickup, which most Charlie Cook, Stu Rothenberg, many political prognosticators were saying this is going into the Republican column. So I think you have a lot of people who are enticed, for better or worse. The Christine O'Donnell's ghost lives on in 2012, if you will. The issue set, too, is also just very relevant. And if you look at what were the issues that dominated the political debate in 2010, the economy, deficits, debt, the size and role of government, a lot of that is still really being debated today and has played a central role in the presidential campaign. So I think, and we'll very likely hear about a lot of those issues tonight in the debate. But I also think, and one of the things I thought was most interesting about 2010 is that it seems to have created a bit of a roadmap for the presidential campaign, and particularly for Republicans. And I think that you have, this time around, a little bit of a change in terms of what the political map looks like in terms of swing states. Oftentimes, we always hear about Ohio, we always hear about Florida, we always hear, the same states over and over again, but this time around, we saw a great deal of a number of expenditures in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa. I think you're seeing a lot of effort in a lot of those states put forward, and I think a lot of that's based on the success that many Republicans saw in 2010. For instance, you saw a Senate race and a governor's race won by Republicans in Wisconsin, a Republican gubernatorial win in Michigan, Iowa, the same thing, and you also had a number of House seats and Senate seats that were won across the board in a lot of those places as well. And so I think that the Romney campaign, in many ways, and Republicans at the national level are looking at those states as, hey, maybe this is the new frontier for Republicans. Well, at the same time, you're starting to see a movement away from some of the southwestern states where I think Republicans are beginning to struggle due to demographic shifts. Republicans do not seem to be doing very well with the Hispanic vote this time around. Obviously, the Hispanic vote was critical to President Bush's election re-election in 2004. I worked in New Mexico in 2004 on the president's campaign as a communications director in New Mexico, and winning the Hispanic vote is absolutely critical, not only to winning this election, but it's actually going to be critical to the longevity of the Republican Party. The party cannot continue to succeed if it has double-digit gender gap and is losing the Hispanic vote by 25, 30, 40 points in an election. There's just not enough voters there. And I think that this map sort of reflects that in the sense that if you look at the Midwest, this new frontier, if you will, for Republicans in many ways, at least at the presidential level, the Republican Party is becoming, according to the data, a party that is predominantly white and that is less educated, if you will, in terms of college degrees, where Democrats are making inroads oftentimes in the suburban areas with white voters and female voters, many of which are college degree or higher. So, oftentimes these areas fall into like the Philadelphia suburbs, the Columbus suburbs, obviously critical points in terms of where the election is being held today. But in looking at 2012, I think what I think is going to be most interesting is that this is really a unique cycle. What makes it really different is the last three elections at the House and congressional level were wave elections. In 2006, Democrats won a big majority in the House and won the majority in the Senate on the coattails of President Bush's sagging approval rating and the issues with the Iraq War. In 2008, it was the financial crisis, the Bush hangover, if you will, and McCain's flagging candidacy at the end, and Obama's strong candidacy too, as well. And then, of course, that all came back in reverse in 2010. And so, really, for the first time, what we're looking at the congressional level is a much different type of race, probably one that's more like 2004. Where the presidential contest is very likely to be tighter. I think we're looking at a tight presidential race, probably 51-48, I think, in my opinion, one way or the other, I think is what we're going to be looking at. And that, of course, has an impact down ballot, and that's going to impact the Senate, that's going to impact the House, and I think at the end of the day, it's not going to lead to a whole lot of movement. But I think and as someone who's witnessed both, I was at the NRCC in the much less glorious cycle of 2008 and saw was on the receiving end of a wave election. You really can tell the differences where when you look at the polling, you look at the numbers, and just one side is just dominating the other side versus the other. Right now, it just seems like a lot of candidates are really fighting each other to a draw. And that's really playing out in the more high-profile Senate races right now in places like North Dakota, Montana, places where Republicans thought we're going to win these seats, no problem. They're turning out to be a little bit more problematic than they had initially anticipated. I think that you're going to see a closer race in Maine, which many on the Democratic side thought would be very easy to win. Once Olympia Snowe retired, I think Scott Brown is fighting a very tough race in Massachusetts. But I think at the same time, you're starting to see the top of the ballot impact start to have an effect, and especially on the demographic side in states like New Mexico and even in Arizona, where the Senate races there are, on the Republican side, the Senate race has really gotten away from us, despite possibly having our best candidate in the country running there. And in Arizona, where the race is significantly tighter than many people expected. So with it being a much closer election, this is really a year where candidates are really going to matter. Whereas before in 2010, if you had an R next to your name and you didn't drool on yourself, you probably had a really good shot at winning as a candidate. And if you're a Democrat in 2008 or 2006 and you were against the Iraq War, you probably had a really good shot at winning. The political forces were just too overwhelming for one side. But I think in this instance, you're going to see that candidates really matter, and I think that at the end of the day, while it won't lead to a lot of movement one way in the House or the other, or one way in the Senate or the other, the quality of candidate really makes an impact, and I think that's why this is going to be much tighter than I think a lot of people anticipated, especially in the Senate. When you looked at the Senate landscape at the very beginning, a lot of people said the Senate's a foregone conclusion, Republicans will win the Senate. So what's going to happen on Election Day? I think that one of the biggest ironies of this entire election is that despite all the frustration with Washington and just the hand-wringing over what is going on and the inability to get things done and the paralysis, this is very likely going to be a status quo election. In the sense, if you look at the congressional races for sure, I think you're looking at anywhere between a 6 to 12 seat gain in the House for Democrats, maybe a 1 to 2 seat gain for Republicans in the Senate. As I said, I think that this is a very close presidential election. I think most people would say that Obama has the edge. I think tonight will play an important role in terms of where the trajectory of the race is headed over the course of the next 4 weeks. But at the end of the day, it's going to be very tight. So I think I find that very interesting because there's just so much frustration with Washington. Congress's approval rating is at an all-time low, and at the end of the day, I think the American public is going to probably vote for something very similar to what we have today. I think that in terms of what does this mean going forward politically and for governing, I think I touched a little bit on the demographic issues. I think that one of the things, whether Romney wins or loses on Election Day or on Election night, I think that the Republican Party itself has a lot of soul-searching to do in terms of how it's going to broaden its appeal, especially when it comes to the demographic issues of the growing Hispanic population and the power of the vote. Also with the gender gap that Republicans have experienced this last time around. The other thing too, I'm curious to figure out in terms of what does this mean not only politically, but what does it mean for governing for 2013 is, does either candidate really have a mandate? And I don't think that anyone has really stopped to think about that because we're so caught up in the process. We're so caught up in the battle between what Romney said versus Obama said. And I think that if Obama were to win, in the instance of an Obama victory, he has spent so much time effectively, I think, defining Romney in the sense that his approval rating is lower than his disapproval rating in some of the key states. He's almost focused on that centrally, right? And so I think that he hadn't had as much of an opportunity to lay out what his governing agenda is going to be for 2013. And I think that when the electorate makes that decision in November, I don't know one way or the other if there really is a wholehearted endorsement there for a wholesale change one way or the other. I think also what's going to happen as a result of the election in terms of governing is that if we're going to have a close difference between the House and the Senate, and no one's going to really have an overwhelming majority. In fact, if it gets closer, if Democrats have even less of a majority, and John Boehner has an even a slimmer majority in the House, what does that leave us with? Well, it could potentially leave us with more gridlock for another 2 years, which I think is at this stage, I think would be relatively unacceptable to the electorate. So I think that when the Congress is made up of very slim majorities, either nothing gets done or very big things get done. And I think that over the course of the last 6 months, the House and the Senate have been quietly ramping up a series of hearings, a lot of outreach on how to reform the tax code. And I think that if there's going to be anything big that happens in the first 6 to 12 months of next year, I think it's going to be a wholesale reform of the tax code. But that means, in this instance, if neither candidate is really in a position to, lay out a mandate or to claim a mandate, I think Congress, in many ways, is going to be almost on par with the president in terms of not only its mandate, because they've been able to push this thing slowly but surely, and getting congressional momentum on anything at this stage is very difficult. It'll be very difficult to kind of turn that away. But at the same time, the president's going to have to be, whoever it is going to have to be mindful of the fact that that the congressional majorities are so slim, and so they're going to have to cede a lot of power, negotiating power, to the houses of Congress. And at the end of the day, I think that gives both John Boehner, Harry Reid, and/or Mitch McConnell a great deal of leverage in terms of dictating the agenda in whatever. In Obama's second term or in a Romney first term. So, with that, I think we can go to Q&A, I guess. But I think I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts that you may have. Hopefully, I went over everything in enough detail, but we can go from there.
Ken, I want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned in your remarks and get you to go a little further if you can. You talked about the gridlock problem. Mm-hmm. If the majority in the Senate is even narrower and the majority in the House is even narrower, do you bear any responsibility for that, or people like you mm-hmm. who select, nominate, groom, and insert into the process the candidates, as you've said you've done in the last several elections? Is there anything that the cadre of political experts mm-hmm. at your level, who are not running for election or not running for office, can do to solve this problem? Or do you think it's not a problem? Or what?
I guess what I would say is that, first of all, I bear absolutely zero responsibility. But I think in the sense where political professionals are concerned, and where or political consultants or people who manage campaigns, I think that I look at campaigns and elections like markets in many ways. I guess maybe that's part of the defining characteristic as to why I'm a Republican, I think. But I think, I think that political professionals kind of look at which way the political wind is going, and then they try to maximize it. They look for an opening in the market, and they try to exploit it. And I think in terms of what we did at the NRCC, in 2010, I think that you had a great deal of dissatisfaction with the way that the country was headed, and given the high unemployment rate and the looming debt and deficit crises. But I think that as political professionals, I think our job is to maximize that opportunity. Now, in the sense where, oftentimes I think political professionals get too much credit, and maybe time is not enough. But I think oftentimes you hear of everything during the Bush administration was a master plot of Karl Rove, and as talented as Karl Rove is, or any other political professional, at the end of the day, it's their job to read the tea leaves and to try and maximize that opportunity. I think that we maximized it. We had historical gains in 2010. I think that in some cases, with members of Congress and in the Senate, they read the 2010 mandate as, hey, look, our job is to serve as a check and balance on Obama. Our job, and I think at times maybe that has been taken a little too literally by some. Not all. I think that Speaker Boehner has tried very hard to try and find ways to come to agreements on big issues. They were within an eyelash of coming together with that grand bargain, hopefully of which we'll see more of in 2013. But
about the debt crisis.
On the debt crisis and trying to reform the tax code. But at the end of the day, I think that if Republicans or Democrats overread their mandate, there's usually a punishment at the end of the line. And in 2006, 2008, Democrats had had a great deal of success, but only to be overwhelmed again in 2010.
But you suggested that maybe there could be comeuppance among the electorate after this election, when the Congress perhaps could be even more gridlocked than it was before. What would that comeuppance be? Just throw out all incumbents? And what kind of opportunity would that provide for someone like you, who is looking for the political wins and looking to maximize it?
Well, historically, while there's oftentimes talk, I'd probably say every odd number year in particular, there's a lot of talk of, this may be the election where incumbents of both parties are thrown out. That's typically rarely the case. In fact, I don't know if it's ever occurred. Usually the public, take points a finger at one side or the other, rightly or wrongly. I do think, though, that in 2013, I think that the public is pretty sick and tired of both sides not coming together. I think that there's frustration with the president, who promised to bring both parties together. I think that there's frustration with Republicans in the House who have worked very hard to oppose the president at every turn when it comes to spending more money or trying to move the economy in a way that Republicans don't see jives with the free market principle. But I think in terms of comeuppance in 2014. Number one, I think the map is very difficult for Democrats. And if you look at the Senate map, it's all the people who won in 2008. And so they came in with the Obama wave. So everybody keeps saying now that 2014 is the year that the Republicans should win back the Senate. However, if they are perceived as stifling opportunity to if a deal it looks like it's within reach, and one side or the other, whether it be the Democrats or the Republicans, are perceived or defined as being obstructing that opportunity, I think that there could be significant political fallout at that point.
Picking up on it's sort of a devil's advocate mode here, in the next election cycle, in 14 and then leading to 16, is it possible that Democrats and Republicans at your level of consideration, having seen an absence of progress on any of the fiscal cliff problem or whatever, we'll talk about that in a minute, but is it possible that people in your position would say, we're going to stop watching which way the winds are blowing and we're going to try to actually get something done so we can claim credit for it in the next election? Or
I don't think that you're ever going to get politicians to stop looking at which way the wind is blowing. I think that what is the Lincoln saying? Without public opinion, you have nothing. Or to some degree of that. And I think that at the end of the day, politicians are as much as many people would like to think that they're influenced by lobbyists in Washington or money-driven special interests. I think at the end of the day, what politicians respond to most is pressure and fear. And it takes a special person to run for public office, usually someone who seeks public approval. And at the end of the day, if more people are going to dislike you than not for doing something or not doing something, I really think that, at least my experience in working with dozens, if not hundreds, of candidates, I'd say that is usually the overwhelming driving force for them.
And one of the tactics that you've used, not just you, but you have used it in your efforts, and we're seeing it again this cycle in which you're not involved, is an overwhelming amount of spending on negative advertising. I think I read that almost 3/4 of the spending on television advertising in this election cycle is being spent on negative ads. You presumably advised candidates at one point that that's the thing to do. Why is that? And doesn't that counter what you just said, which is about you don't want people to feel, the politician doesn't want people to feel badly about them, about what they're doing?
I think that number one, I think that it's a candidate's job to provide contrast. I really do. It's your job as a candidate to point out what you believe are your opponent's flaws and what you believe are your assets. Number one. Now, I think, I'll tell you a story. I think that everybody always says that they don't like political advertising, and I've never in all 50 states.
Negative advertising or political advertising.
Well, probably both, but I think they'll tell you that they don't like negative advertising, and I think that in the dozens of states that I've been, everybody always says, well, negative advertising doesn't work here. I don't know how you do it in Washington, D.C., but I'll tell you what, it doesn't work here in Texas or Midland, Texas, or Los Angeles, California, or whatever. And the cruel fact is it does work. It does work. And the reason, and I'll tell you a great story, is we had a special election in New York a couple of years ago, and there was this woman who went to this debate, and in a roll call had sent a reporter up there to cover the debate. And we had been trying to go after the Democrat for being, ironically, a Wall Street politician who outsourced jobs overseas. And they were right. And on the Democratic side, they were going after our opponent for having never served a day in the private sector and only being a professional politician, and which was obviously an interesting intellectual exercise. But I think when you're running, so we're running these TV ads, and we've been running them for weeks, and they go to a candidate forum where this reporter goes. And this woman stands up in the crowd and says, I just want to decry this negative campaigning. It's terrible. Nobody responds to it. I just cannot do it. And they asked the woman, after it was over, the reporter asked this woman, well, who are you voting for? What's your choice? And she goes, well, I can't, I just really don't like the Democratic candidate. He's just another, Wall Street politician who outsourced jobs overseas, but I'll never vote for a career politician. And at that point you realize, okay, well, clearly she's reciting your advertising verbatim, yet telling you she's making up her own mind. And I think, that I think it does sway people at the end of the day. I think when you put $1 million behind a week worth of television, it's going to have an impact.
We're touching on advertising here, presumably, and as a media guy, I want to ask a media-related question, because you didn't actually talk about it in your remarks, though you did in class. The media's diminishing resources, not just covering politics, but in your case, obviously specifically covering politics, and the increasing role of advertising, and especially, as you said in class, the role of YouTube and other social media in conveying those video messages in addition to the broadcast market. I don't see any move in the right direction here. It's going to be more negative advertising, fewer reporters around to critique it or keep it in check, and more politicians seeking to do more of the same stuff, both on broadcast and on social media.
Yeah, I think that there's two things at play. Number one is that the traditional media, their job is to play referee, right? And it's their job to say, look, this is what you said is factually inaccurate here, or, because remember, if a news organization says what the ad that you ran is factually inaccurate and calls it false, then your opponent then has the opportunity to take that ad and put the newspaper, rating of calling it false on TV, and then saying that essentially what you're doing is manufacturing inaccuracy. So, that's, first of all, I think that the job of the media is incredibly important when it comes to political campaigns.
The traditional media, you said.
Both. And I think both, but I think that what's happening now is that social media is now beginning to overtake that. And I think, and I expressed this in the class earlier today, is one of my biggest frustrations has been with the traditional media because of budget cuts. There just really isn't as much opportunity to kind of cover the news in the way that it really deserves to be covered. And I would point out what's happening in the Middle East right now in terms of, you have this powder keg that's ready to go off, and I think that right now the focus seems to be, well, didn't Mitt Romney respond 2 hours too early to this crisis, and what does this matter to Obama? And how does his position on Libya make Obama look strong and presidential? And there seems to be a lot more focus on the process as opposed to what is the actual news that's breaking on the ground. And so I think that does a disservice, and it keeps the electorate uninformed on critical issues. But however, at the same time, you have this rise of social media, and I think that the power of it has really changed the landscape in a sense where, for better or worse, I think you have things that pop up online, whether it's through Twitter or Facebook or on YouTube and some of these other new channels that can be just grossly inaccurate, but people latch onto and run with them. At the same time, they can be like the ultimate truth squad, I mean, and you have, for instance, we've had a very recent example of this where a candidate was caught saying some things behind closed doors and have been now used verbatim as a political ad. The most recent ad that the president's using against candidate Romney is just that clip. It's just he's using the video verbatim. So I think that the rise of social media gives an avenue and an insight into something else. I think the last thing I would point out is that before in campaigns, it used to be able to have these kind of discrete messages where, Republicans, if you just look at the Republican universe, you would say, okay, well, we're going to be in the mailbox and we're going to talk to social conservatives this way, and we're going to talk about all our family values issues here, and then then we'll mail to the fiscal conservatives and talk about tax cuts and economic freedom, etc., all the other things. But now what's happened is that the media has really changed. The social media has changed that, and I think one of the best examples of that was 2008, where you had President Obama giving a speech in San Francisco, where he said that people in Pennsylvania, essentially cling to guns and religion. And of course, it was in the middle of the Democratic primary, and Hillary Clinton then, that ended up on Twitter or on YouTube, and of course then Hillary Clinton was able to take what was a discrete message meant only for the donor community to get them to buy in and give him more money, and use that into a TV ad and put that into Pennsylvania advertising, and then where she ended up winning by 20 points. So, that there's this change in the media that's now kind of keeping everything on the record.
Does that change in the media towards social media's influence make it easier for someone like you doing the job you were doing, or does it make it harder to keep your candidate on message, for example?
It's a double-edged sword. I think number one, I think that oftentimes it's referred to in consulting world as owned media. It's media without a filter, right? It's your YouTube page, it's your website, it's your Facebook page, it's your Twitter handle, all those things. You get to own them, and you get to communicate to your audience unfiltered without the media, then getting to filter it themselves and package your quote into a story or whatever on both sides. So I think in that sense, it's incredibly empowering. Something can go viral, and you can become a YouTube sensation overnight, for better or worse. And so in that sense, it's a double-edged sword. I think that you get caught saying one thing and it goes live, and in a few hours, 10 million people can see it.
We have as you know, we stream this program over Second Life, so it's seen around the world, and we have a question from someone in the Netherlands who is actually reflecting something you just mentioned a few moments ago, which is the events in the Middle East. Do you think looking at this election cycle the way it is now, do you think those events actually will affect, one way or another, the presidential race or the Senate race, for example?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's interesting, and I was kind of discovering this, and I was wondering the same thing about a week ago. And in one of the recent Wall Street Journal NBC polls, you had seen a significant drop in President Obama's handling of foreign policy crises. I think he had dropped somewhere between the vicinity of 8 to 10 points, which is significant. Yet at the same time, he's not moving in the head-to-head on the ballot in terms of where he stood with Romney. And I think that tells me that while people may disapprove, or less people may approve of the president's handling of foreign policy crises, it's still not a dominant issue. The economy is just dictating the way that this election is going, and it is the terrain in which this election will be decided on, I think.
Let's turn to some questions from our audience. We'll do our usual thing, take a question from a student, a question from a non-student. Let's start with a student tonight. Question from a student. Yes, sir.
My district's incumbent, he's an old guy, been in the community forever, and he's running against a transplant of sorts. And he's only been the challenge has only been in the district for maybe like 5 to 6 years. To what degree do parties move
Let me paraphrase the question,
Sure.
just because not everybody can
Sure.
hear it. Questioner is, what state are you from?
New York.
Okay, question is referring to a candidate in New York who's running for a congressional office. He described the candidate as a transplant candidate who had only been in the state for 5 or 6 years. And the question to you is, to what extent would someone in your position, your previous position at the NRCC, for example, try to plant a candidate like that in position by moving them from one state to another?
Typically, that's pretty difficult, I think. However, if maybe the candidate is from, the same county, but lives, maybe a few miles outside of the district, that's one story, I think. If you're trying to transplant, someone from New York City into Midland, Texas, I think it's going to be more difficult. But I think at the end of the day, I think that what happens is, we've had this. I mean, I've been on the losing side of races where the opponent has not been from the district. I've been on the winning side where the opponent has not been from the district or the state. I think to the degree that it matters, I don't think it matters nearly as much. I do think that if you can find some sort of evidence, though, to back up the claim that therefore, because they're not from here, they don't get us. So, if you're from Midland, if you're a New Yorker and running in Midland, Texas, and you said something 10 years ago where you think we ought to ban all oil drilling, well, then you can make the argument that this is someone who's not only geographically out of touch, but really just doesn't understand the values of the district, right? And so I think that's how, I think voters need reinforcement when it comes to trying to make a case like that, I'd say.
Let me connect that question.
Does that make sense? I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's all right. Let me connect that question to another aspect that you were just talking about, which is, does the rise of the social media, which is viral regardless of political boundaries, obviously, and certainly not legislative districts, make it harder or make it easier, shall we say, for a transplanted candidate to win or lose an election in a local district, because it doesn't really matter anymore what's going on in that district. What matters is what's on YouTube or what's on Twitter.
No, I still think that at the end of the day that, all politics is local, and I think that most people want to make a connection. While the issue set may be a national one, or there may be national frustration with one party or another, at the end of the day, you still have to find a way to make that connection, whether it's in Delaware or New Jersey. But I think we had a great candidate who last cycle was a Philadelphia Eagle, had played for the Philadelphia Eagles, and was running in neighboring New Jersey, which many people in that district actually commute into Philadelphia and are part of the Philadelphia media market and are fans of the Philadelphia Eagles. And but this was a candidate who had been living in San Diego playing for the Chargers, the last season, I think, or the last 2 seasons. But he was able to come home, and while people I thought were interested in the fact that he played NFL football in their favorite media market, they wanted to know at the end of the day, well, wait a minute, what does your candidacy still matter to me? And making that personal connection, oftentimes it's a pocketbook connection. How are you going to make my life better? How is my mortgage going to be more affordable? Or how is my family member going to have a job? At the end of the day, I think that you have to have that local understanding and that finger on the pulse of the district or the state to be able to make a real viable case.
Question from a non-student. Question from a non-student? Yes, sir.
Do you think that having 2 entrenched parties is the optimal number of parties, and if there were more, would that make your job harder or easier?
Okay, question is, do you think that having just 2 major political parties is the optimal number, or if there were more effective parties at the national level or at the local level, would that make your job more difficult or easier?
That's a really good question. I think that it would probably make the job harder in the sense that you have to kind of learn how to navigate a more bumpy political terrain. On the flip side of the coin, it probably means that there's a lot more opportunity out there for someone to go, market their skill set, and maybe it means more business at the end of the day, right? So I do think that in terms of 2 parties being the optimal parties, I don't know the answer to that. I would say that in terms of a lot of people are always asking, well, how come we don't have an independent party? How come we can't get behind a good third-party candidate who maybe is a blend of both the best parts of both of both parties. I think it's very difficult because independent candidates typically lack the party infrastructure, number one, to mobilize voters, to build a coalition. You essentially be building a coalition from scratch. And also, typically, but not always, independent voters are just, they're not typically as engaged as a Republican-based voter or a Democratic-based voter is. That's why they're called the base. They always turn out, even in the worst of years, right? It's the independent voter that's the swing. And so trying to mobilize that kind of loose affiliation of voters for whom maybe social issues make them tick or fiscal issues make them tick, I think it's difficult to harness that. However, with that said, to nuance that my position even further, I would say that going back to the campaigns and elections are like markets theory, there wasn't a serious opening in the market in 1992, and you had Ross Perot who ran, spent a lot of his own money and got 20% of the vote. Now, this is a gentleman who. Who has an amazing business record, but at the same time as a candidate, dropped out of the race because he said something to the effect of, if he didn't, Dan Quayle was going to, do something negative to his children. I can't remember what it was exactly, and yet he still garnered 20% of the vote. So he also said that the CIA was spying on him because George H.W. Bush didn't want him to win the election. So you have. And a candidate there who was, even with all that said, who dropped out, was able to fill a 20% void in the electorate because people were frustrated with Bush. They felt that he had let them down, and they didn't fully trust Clinton at the time because he was coming out of a very nasty primary and was perceived as someone who wasn't exactly a straight shooter on the facts. Right opportunity, possibility.
Sorry.
Sorry.
We have a follow-up question from New York. Someone watching us on Second Light from New York is asking whether, and since it is a debate night, I'm going to pass it along here, what your view is of third-party candidates participating in debates, both at the presidential level and perhaps even at the state level.
I think that a third-party candidate has to pass a basic threshold, and they have to prove that they're viable. I think that otherwise we'd have debates with...
What does that mean, viable? Was Ross Perot viable?
I think Ross Perot was viable. I think that he was able to, he exhibited a level of performance in the polling. I think, depends. I think, some people would say, well, if you reach a 5% threshold or a 10% threshold, you should be allowed into a debate. Otherwise, I think we'd have, every party, the Constitutional Party or whatever, the Libertarian Party candidate, we could end up with a presidential candidate debate with 40 people standing on the stage.
And what would be the problem with that?
Well, I think it's harder to have a real debate on the issues when you have that many people standing on stage, segmenting, especially if they're candidates who I don't think would have a chance of winning. I mean, there's I think that there are people like Ralph Nader, who maybe had an argument to make in 2000, or obviously Ross Perot in 1992. But there has to be some sort of threshold. I should not be the final arbiter of that threshold, but whether the debate committee or whoever, presidential debate committee comes up with a threshold, I think it's something to consider. I think that at the end of the day, I think voters want to hear a full-throated debate over the issues.
Considering that I think the Republicans had 20 or 22 debates over the course of the primary season, did your party learn anything from that about the value of having lots of candidates on the stage, or the lack of value?
I think it gave voice to a lot of candidates who otherwise would not have been very viable. I think that you had some candidates like Herman Cain and others who maybe didn't have much of a political operation, who didn't have much of a traditional campaign, if you will, but showed up at debates and voters as a result responded to them. So I think it gives a forum to people who maybe don't have the resources or means to launch a full-scale campaign, but maybe are good at making an articulate argument on the stage. I think at the end of the day, though, however, the process kind of weeds those people out. The Michelle Bachmans of the world, the Herman Cains of the world, while they can make an articulate case, at the end of the day, their job as a candidate is to make that case to as many voters as possible. And if you don't have the means or the resources to do so, not only will you not make it to the Republican primary, then you're probably not going to be a very viable candidate in the general election. And you want, at the end of the day, a candidate who hopefully can do all of the above.
Let's take a question from a student. Question from a student? Yes, ma'am.
What has been your experience in recruiting candidates for Republican races that are not white males, non-traditional candidates such as Latinos and women?
Okay, question is, what has been your experience at recruiting candidates for office who are not white men, but who might be women, who might be other minorities, Hispanics, African Americans?
We had a very successful recruiting cycle last cycle. Particularly after Chris Christie and Bob McDonnell won their races in the governor's race in 2009. And so it was a lot easier then to start incentivizing candidates to get in. In terms of, we had a very large number of female candidates who ran and won in 2010 who have not only turned out to be great candidates, but I think turned out to be excellent members of Congress. On the minority side, it's a little more difficult. It's not easy to find. There isn't exactly a large bench of Hispanic or African American candidates in the legislatures or hanging around, itching
in either
around.
party?
I think on the Republican side. I think Democrats have an easier time of doing that. I think that they have a message that I think has successfully, at least thus far, has successfully reached out to a larger demographic of the electorate. At the same time, I would say, female candidates for Republicans are very difficult to beat. I find. I think that because they tend to close the gender gap, and if they can perform well with the traditional Republican voter, that dominates that dominates our side of the electorate. It's almost like you're juicing, the numbers 2-3 points just by having a female candidate that's a Republican. So, it's not for lack of trying. I think that we're having more and more success. We had some, obviously Marco Rubio. We had some excellent candidates, Hispanic candidates that won in 2010 on the House side. Ted Cruz from Texas is obviously Hispanic, and I think Vernon Parker from Arizona actually gave the Republican address. He's an African American from Arizona who gave the Republican response address to President Obama's speech. And then in Utah, there's a great candidate by the name of Mia Love, who is who it would be, if she wins, would be the first African American female Republican to serve in Congress, and I think she's going to win.
Okay. Question from a non-student. Yes, sir.
Based on your experience, could you address the issue of desire for legacy? How might that play out in a scenario where the president's reelected and Speaker Boehner and even the leader of the Senate? It's pretty clear to me what the president would want for a legacy, but how might that interact with the others? This is another element in second-term presidency.
Okay, question is, in a second-term presidency, if President Obama were to win, how would both Democrats and Republicans in Congress, how would the issue of their legacy, the legacy of that Congress, play out politically over the next few years?
I actually think that's possibly, I think that's an incredibly interesting question, not only because for the president, legacy is always important, especially in the second term, as you mentioned, but I think that in the House and the Senate, you have a majority leader in the Senate who, is getting older and whose time, I think, as the leader is probably coming closer to an end than it is the beginning. And then in the House, John Boehner, who's been in the House for a very long time, has, I think, made it relatively clear that he's willing to sacrifice his speakership to do something that has a lasting impact. I don't think he's a guy who wants to be the speaker for 10 or 12 years. I don't think he wants to grow up to be Tip O'Neill. I think he'd rather be speaker for 4 to 6 and have a lasting imprint and get something done. So you may have an instance here in 2013 where you have all three of the people at the negotiating table who are kind of starting to think about, well, what does this mean for me long term, and what does this mean for the country long term? I think all three individuals do think that and do care about that. The question is then, how do you mesh that with caucuses and conferences who consist of people who are up for election every 2 years, and who have their short-term interests in mind. And so, I don't know, it'd be very interesting if anybody can do it, at least in the House. I think John Boehner can. I think he is an exceptional politician. He is a politician's politician in the sense that he understands the inner workings of the House and how it operates and what makes members tick. I think that he could probably get a majority of Republicans at the end of the day to come to some sort of massive deal if it means overhauling the tax code. But they're going to need Democrats to come along with it. It's going to be when you have major compromise legislation, one party really can't rule the day. It really has to be kind of both everybody interlocking arms and jumping together.
And although you hinted at it, let me ask you more explicitly, do you think that factor, the legacy factor that you were just talking about, is going to push Congress and the president in the right direction away from the cliff in January, the cliff that they established themselves, after all, over financial issues, debt issues, tax issues, interest rate issues, and so on? Is it going to be enough to do that?
If I were to guess, and this is simply a guess, and I am not an expert when it comes to, I think if you asked anyone in Washington what they thought was going to happen in the lame duck, I think that they would all be guessing. But my guess is that they will likely punt on a series of critical issues for a few months, 6, 8, 9, 10 months, to buy themselves time. And they'll attach it, they'll pass the legislation with some sort of attachment saying, this buys us X amount of time to come to an agreement on reforming the tax code and finding revenue to close the deficit. And I think that because something like this just can't be passed overnight, I think it's going to take a lot of time to come to an agreement of a large enough magnitude to bring down the deficit and reform the code. But I think that's going to, in the lame duck in particular, it typically, you're going to have a lot of members of Congress who just lost, depending on how the election shakes out. For instance, if Romney were to win the election, it's not really in Obama's interest necessarily to make it easier on the Republicans for 2013. So he may want to do some things and not others, or vice versa. Obama may be saying, "Look, no, I won the election and I want action now, and we're going to do something now, but we'll do something more down the road." I don't know. I think a variation of things can occur, but I think that the lame duck in particular, there's just so much and so little time to negotiate something. I think that they're going to have to buy themselves some time into 2013.
The cynical journalist in me says, isn't that exactly what got us to this point? Congress saying we'll put it off until after the election, and then we'll deal with it. Give us more time to.
Yeah, I think. Look, I mean, you've had commission after commission. Simpson Bowles was a commission that was put together to buy time for the administration. And then when the debt ceiling came, then it was like, well, now we'll push this off until after the election. So we needed a super committee because the regular Congress couldn't get it done. I think at some point Congress is going to have to bite the bullet, and I think that there is a willingness. There's going to be more willingness to do it in 2013 than there has been, though, this last year.
Question from a student. Yes, ma'am.
How do you think the Republican Party can or should overcome its demographic challenge?
Okay, questions about the demographic challenges for the Republican Party that you touched on, actually, in your remarks, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. What are the challenges for the Republican Party, and how would you, if you were king for a day, try to solve them?
I think it's going to be. I think first of all, I think it's going to take time. I think that on issues like
what are the challenges, the demographic challenges?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think you have African Americans voting for Democrats at 90+%. You have the Hispanic vote going right now looking at 70-30 in the Democrats' favor. You have a gender gap that's hurting Republicans. To the extent that we're down, steep double digits on the gender gap. You have younger voters who I think were very much in favor of President Obama in 2008, but over time have now started. They're not quite in the same. Obama doesn't enjoy quite the same amount of support from that group. I mean, if you think about it, if you were a freshman in college when you started and you were old enough to vote for President Obama, and 4 years later you don't have a job or you're living with your parents. You're probably going to have a little bit of a different take. That's not to mean that that many of them aren't still supportive, but it means that you're going to lose some of that support. So I think that, first of all, I think that, the first step is acknowledging you have a problem. And I think that in some instances we don't have that. So I think acknowledging the problem, I think in terms of how we conduct ourselves during the debate on issues like immigration reform, I think oftentimes if you
during the presidential debates that are this fall.
Yeah, I think or over the course of the next few years, I think that typically what would happen if you ever watch Spanish language television, you turn on, like my grandmother does, and watches Univision, and she's watching, and they're talking about immigration. Of course, they bring on the Spanish-speaking Latino Democrat, and then they bring on, the white Republican who doesn't speak a lick of Spanish, to debate them. And of course, like right away, as a viewer and as a voter, you start to see a difference there. So I think that part of it's recruitment in terms of who our messengers are. I think part of it is making sure that we're careful of how we discuss issues like immigration reform, and a lot of the debate consists of vitriol, and I think that it turns off a lot of voters. But I also think that the path President Bush was very successful in 2004 with Hispanic voters, partially because of his position on immigration reform. He was for a guest worker program. He was also very strong on education. And education for many people, for many immigrants who come to this country, usually they're leaving their country because they want a better life for their children. And they view that the path to success for their children is through a good education. And so I think that was another reason why President Bush was successful. And I think that there's an opportunity there on the education front right now as well.
Is there a connection between that question and the role of social issues in the Republican Party? Do social issues and the devotion to them in the Republican Party help or hurt solving the demographic problem?
I don't think that it's, look, I think that, when it comes to any party, you have to put together a coalition. And one of the things that we mentioned in class is on issues like abortion or gay rights or some of the other issues, the so-called social issues. The social conservative voter makes up a critical part of the Republican Party in the respect that they're very loyal voters. They are typically your most active as volunteers. And also, if going back to the campaigns and elections are like markets theory, if Republicans abandon that segment of the electorate, that gives Democrats an opening to then go after that segment of voters. Maybe they don't go after them on issues related to abortion or gay marriage, but for instance, we get 2, 4, 5, 6 years down the road, and maybe an issue like the environment becomes more of a moral issue or a moral calling, and Democrats are therefore able to break off 20% of the social conservative constituency by bringing people over on that. That's the election, and that can change the dynamic of the electorate very quickly. So. You hear from Republicans oftentimes, well, we just abandoned the social conservatives, we would just start winning elections. And maybe for a while, a short time, but and I don't even know if that's necessarily true. But I think that you have to be careful what you wish for when you start saying we're willing to just get rid of entire blocks of a party.
You mentioned gay marriage as an issue, but to what extent? There was a time when, for the Republican Party, those issues of gender equality, gay marriage, and so on, HIV, AIDS, and so on, related issues, when those were just sort of really core critical issues to electing Republicans. Do you still see it that way, and maybe project a bit? Within the next 10 years, will those issues continue to be so important to the Republican Party?
I think that they'll play a role. I don't know. I think over time, as you see a shift in the voting age of the population, especially of people of my generation, younger generation, I think that the issue of gay marriage is becoming less and less of an issue, at least in terms of a front burner issue. I think that a lot of people that are younger really don't seem, to either they are fully in favor or they're agnostic on it. I do think that. What I'm seeing in terms of younger Republicans is that it's becoming much more of a libertarian party that cares more about fiscal and economic issues and less so about social issues. Also, this election, I think, and I think also part of it was because the economy was such a huge, has played such a huge role, and we've been mired in such difficult circumstances that the social issue voter, at least for the time being, has become much more of an economic focused or fiscally focused voter. And I think that for right now, at least, I think that's where we are. That those are the kind of litmus test issues. I think are the fiscal issues much more so for Republicans than the social issues were before.
We have a viewer of our program in Texas tonight who is addressing you with the following question. I don't know if it's a man or a woman who's asking, but they're asking about what they're calling the elephant in the room in this election. It pertains to Governor Romney's candidacy, and that is his Mormon religion. We haven't mentioned that. It hasn't been mentioned much in the campaign so far. Do you think, as someone who's analyzed polls for years and has tried to figure out what voters have in their minds, that will be a factor or won't be a factor when people go to the voting booth on November 6th?
It may be a factor for some, for a small segment of the electorate. I think it was much more of a problem for him in the Republican primary, in the sense that in order to get through a state like South, typically the Republican primary goes through South Carolina. And he lost South Carolina to Newt Gingrich, but then was able to beat him in Florida. I think that part of that had to do with the relative weakness of the Republican field. And so he was able to get by. I think that it was more of an issue in the Republican primary, but less so of an issue in the general election. I think that right now people are really looking to find out whether or not he is a viable alternative to the president, whether he can really make a case for what he plans to do over the course of the next 4 years.
Okay. Question from a non-student. We have one? Yes, sir.
Can you comment on the Norquist pledge, any future pledges, any unwritten pledges?
Okay, questions about the Norquist pledge not to raise taxes, which many members of your party and of Congress have signed.
Right.
What's the impact of that in the future?
I think that a lot more has been made of it in the respect that somehow Republicans are signing away their political life to Grover Norquist. I think that when you sign a pledge, you're signing a pledge. Whether you sign a pledge or you make a promise on the campaign trail, either or, you're making that promise to your constituents and to the people that elect you. And if you want to put your name down on the dotted line and say, I'm going to draw a line in the sand to, on the Second Amendment or taxes or, reforming the education system, I think that's, clearly within your right as a candidate. I think that, there's going to be, at some point, a push that comes to, push comes to shove at some point where people are going to have to live up to those promises, though. And I think that's going to be where the rubber meets the road. And I think, I personally believe that, if you're making a commitment to your constituents, you ought to abide by that. And if that's how, hopefully someone who signs a pledge like that or makes a promise views it that way, and not in another way. Because I think at the end of the day, if you do break that pledge, while the focus right now is really on, on taxes being kind of a Republican litmus test, you're going to see, if I were a Democratic operative and my Republican and I was advising a candidate who was running against an opponent who signed the pledge and then broke that pledge, that's the first ad that I put on television. This is a person who made a promise to you and he broke it, or she broke it. And it's not, so while there's a lot of pressure on Republicans right now, a lot of that pressure is also kind of pushed in the House and in the Senate by Democrats who would really like to see Republicans break that pledge in an opportunity to create votes for them on Election Day.
Question from a student. Yes, sir.
How does the Republican, or the National Republican Congressional Committee's approach to a race change when we go from having maybe a non-viable candidate for national office that becomes viable because a third-party candidate enters the race, not saying anything related to Delaware? How does their approach to the race, or will the Senate committee, Republican Senate committee, change when that happens?
Before I paraphrase the question, are you talking about House or Senate race, or are you talking about a presidential race?
I'm talking about a House or Senate race.
Okay, so the question's about a House or Senate race. How does the entry of a third-party candidate into a race affect the two major parties, their prospects, and especially if the two major parties don't have a really strong candidate to begin with, or if one of them doesn't? Right.
I think, I guess the example I would use is the one in Maine that's going on right now. Is you had an independent governor, Angus King, I believe his name is, who's running, and he has essentially, with a wink and a nod, said, if I get elected, I'm going to caucus with the Democrats. So he's effectively a Democrat in terms of what in terms of just the ballot, right? But there is a Democratic candidate that's running, and the Democratic candidate's not very well known. She's a progressive, relatively, traditional Democrat coming out of the Northeast, and she's not really getting a great deal of attention. The National Republican Senatorial Committee, my counterpart for the Senate, has a Republican candidate named Charlie Summers, who's a good candidate running, but it's Maine, it's a presidential year, tough sledding for any Republican candidate. In Maine, much less alone when you have a guy like President Obama at the top of the ticket who's going to bring additional strength to the Democratic side of the ballot. And so I know what the Republicans have been doing in this instance is they've been running a series of ads to boost the name identification of the Democrat in the race, to try and water down the independent voters, so that way Democratic voters who say, hey, I like Angus King, Governor King, I think he's done a good job. Oh, wait, there's this Democrat in the race? Oh, wait, that's who I'm with. And that's essentially the dynamic that's being created in Maine. I think, though, in those three instances, you have to have three essentially viable candidates. And coming up with third-party candidates that are viable, as I mentioned earlier, I think is very difficult. And I don't think that you're seeing that anywhere else, really, at this stage, anywhere else in the country.
I know that many of you want to get to see the presidential debate, so we're going to close the program tonight. But before we say thanks to Ken Spain, just a word about what happens in 2 weeks. The next National Agenda programs are very special programs. We will, on Tuesday, November 16th, conduct consecutive debates right on this stage among candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate from Delaware. And then on Wednesday, October 17th, we'll hold the debates right here for Delaware Governor and Lieutenant Governor, right in this room for free tickets. You can go to any one of the UD box offices. And any of you who remember the debates in 2010 that were held here at UD as well know how exciting it was to have our debates broadcast nationally. And I can announce tonight that, once again, the debates for the Senate and the governor's race here in Delaware will be broadcast nationally on C-SPAN. If you are not already on our email list for these programs, I hope you'll put your name on one of those bright orange sheets out in the lobby on your way out. Clearly print your email address because we've got to be able to read it. If you want to watch the debates tonight without going someplace else, you can walk right next door to Gore Hall in room 116 or across the street, across South College Street to 120 Smith Hall. Now, let's please thank Ken Spain for his visit to the University of Delaware. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. We'll see you in 2 weeks.